This is the Derivations of Synchronism in the Greater Context of 20th Century Art, presented by Joshua Ang, Ph.D. of Monsters University. To understand the greater contextualization and its place in the 20th century, we must look at early 1900s art contextualization and what it brings to the context of synchronism. One of the most famous examples, of course, is Fauvism, which expanded out of Expressionism and Impressionism to bring in colors and its use of Abstractism to bring in its place to the greater concept of modernism. You'll see its influences from the 19th century as more traditional art, but at the same time its more creative use of color. The other famous example of the 1900s art is, of course, Cubanism. And through Cubanism, you'll see famous artists like Pablo Picasso use. And of course, while it's quite abstract, it's usually used to portray art from a different dimension and from different shapes, and use more 3D shapes to present people, places, and things, and more creative uses. And of course, you would have Pablo Picasso's later use of Cubanism to be more abstract, and its less use of dimensions to be more representative of more abstract people, music, and things to fit in to this specific time and place. When we expand out to the 1900s, we'll see other arts, while not quite as direct in its influence to synchronism and Morgan Russell, but we can definitely see its place into modernism. Of course, Expressionism used to portray more mood out of art, and it's out of its influence of Impressionism, while quite more classical and traditional of all the arts shown so far, is still very influential through its use of mood and color. It quite distorts shapes, however, and through its distortion it's able to bring more of a mood and specific aura to its art. And of course, Dadaism, quite famously out of the First World War. It was completely abstract, and it used specific pop culture pieces and existing art to be an extremely abstract version of art in which it used, in which it used more of the perspective instead of direct influence of the artist. And through its perspective, you were able to completely understand its unique artistic value, and it's, quite influential to modernism. And it's, you'll see in the next piece, the famous toilet, of course, its abstraction out of meaning and its rejection of traditionalism, and quite famously fascism out of Dadaism is quite meaningless, and it comes out of art, not out of necessity, but as art, as a different way of viewing the world. And of course, these more extreme views of Dadaism and art came to strongly influence modernism as a whole. However, if we're looking at influences of synchronism, the most influential has to be Orphism. And while it's clearly seen the distinctions and the similarities of the two art styles, it is rejected by synchronists that Orphism is completely unrelated and irrelevant to the creation of synchronism. But due to its place in the timeline of Orphism preceding synchronism, we do have to understand its effects culturally and historically to synchronism. And of course, Orphism heavily influenced from the previous art styles of the 20th century. Out of it came from its art theory from Charles Henry and Paul Signac, originally theorized, but the two were not artists themselves. They proposed in specific manifestos that Orphism to be derived out of more abstract, and well, we'll see from the examples that Orphism isn't necessarily abstract, and it can be used to display buildings and people. As you see from the example here with the Eiffel Tower, you will see that it does bring into one of the first uses of abstractism. You'll see one of the most famous Orphists is Fernand Lagarde and his use of tubism. I don't have an example here, and I really wish I did, but tubism was very influential in its use of tubes as shapes and its examples, and of course it was completely abstract. And you will see this transition from early Orphism, from that materialistic, more representative art style, into the completely abstract form, which we'll see out of abstraction. And Orphism's main details are its color, its use of strong, bolded colors, along with slight details, and its foundation from action done by Robert Dulé and his wife Sonia Turk, who themselves went out of Charles Henry's art theory and done most of the Orphist work. You'll see that other examples of Orphism here, more abstract later versions. And of course Orphism, as you'll see with Synchronism, is not quite long-term in of its effects of such as Expressionism, Dadaism, and Cubism, and its terms of effects to 20th and even 21st century art. But you will have to understand its period of time was much shorter, and its influence was not quite international, and it was much more regional. And Orphism, of course, out of French art, and in contrast to Synchronism's more American-centered art. And out of that, you'll have to see Morgan Russell, I'd say, is easily the founder of Synchronism. And of course, he expanded out of with Stanton MacDonald's Wright and his work in France, especially on theory. And the two very well focused in France, and while in art school, very young in the 1910s, on the idea of the theory of art, and they themselves wrote many manifestos on Synchronism, and they especially focused on the ideas of music and color. And out of music and color, you will use this very new and innovative form of art, and at least this new perspective of creating art. And of course, music and color itself, while very elemental to art and its nature from very centuries before, these two were never really brought together, as music is quite abstract in its idea of physical engagement. However, Morgan Russell and Stanton MacDonald Wright themselves were able to incorporate the two through their manifesto of viewing color in the same way that music sees notes, and through that view of color is the use of scales and its use of modal beginning. Well, modalism is not invented yet and is later created in the 20th century. You had to understand its view of scales and melody with music. And as you can see on the painting on the right, you will understand how he uses from the beginning to the center, and it expands out, as does music does with chords and notes and scales, and its use of branching out and creating similar yet different and more tasteful abstractions out of that original core idea. And of course, you have to understand Morgan Russell's effect on American modernism. He was easily, I'd say, the first American modernist. He really brought the idea of Cubism, well, not necessarily the idea of Cubism, but the abstractism of Cubism, Expressionism, and Dadaism into America, as America is over the pond from France, and he was able to bring this idea of abstractism quite largely. You'll see other paintings of Morgan Russell and its use of color, quite tertiary in its use of colors, but quite bold in its use of shading also. This is personally one of my favorites. You can see the dimensions and the music and how this colors expand out in a scalar way. Of course, we'll have to look at his most famous work is the Synchrony in Orange. I'd say greatest piece of work ever. And you can take a minute to look at its beauty. And of course, this beautiful work of art created by Morgan Russell. Uses its ideas of colors and shapes as a unique and quite bold understanding of art and synchronism as a whole. And we'll go into depth piece by piece of this art and to better understand the greater derivations of synchronism in its context to 20th century abstract art. If we go to the top corner, we can see how the shapes and its definition bring in its view of perspective into the specific view of art. And as you can see by the big shapes, and it's very, I'd say, undefined and elementary shape. However, at the same time, if you look very close, you can see its divisions into quite more volumetric and geometric views, in which if you change your perspective, you can actually see that the shapes and elementary, quite easy to understand shapes quickly turn into very abstract, more fluid shapes. And as you can see from the top right hand corner of that little red and green, the second one closer to you, you quite easily see it as a quite pyramid shaped thing going in towards out, but at the same time when you look very close, you could see that as actually a part of the arc of a circle. And as you look closer up into the more purple gray area, you're able to see its addition of more dimensions and shapes in that little divot. And of course you have to recognize the use of darkness and shading as used in this art. As you can see, the shapes all over are quite elementary in color, yet their use of shading and its use of blending into the background is able to give its definition, yet also abstraction into its colors. As we look at the next page, while not as defined through its dimensions, is much more bold in its color, and it's much more, how do you say it, all over the place with its use of shapes. And of course, compared to the last slide, which we looked at, was very defined and very, not quite abstract. However, this side shows you much more of the abstractions of synchronism. And while we aren't able to see the more fluid derivations of this use of color and use of scales, we are able to see how this different, more fluid change of shapes and definition is used. And of course, you can see that the fluidity of the shapes, as you can see the triangle down there, is very easy to understand. However, if you move out of it, it's quite beautiful how the abstraction is, and its use of turning a quite 2D painting, 2D surface of canvas, into very dimensional and very robust shapes. And of course, these shapes have very little consensus on what they hold. I mean, you could see that top orange, top yellow and green piece as two pyramids shaped together, and then yellow sparking out. But at the same time, you could also see them as one piece together, holding together as a V. Again, there's no consensus on these, but the very abstract and fluid shapes of these give very, very different perspectives. And as we go to the bottom left-hand side of the painting, it gets much darker in its tone, but however, as you look closer, these shapes are very ambiguous, honestly, and it's, while not as robust as the shapes and colors seen in the previous slides in the top half, you're able to see its use of darker colors and how those darker colors are able to also be used with more darker colors to expand out of that very robust shape. And you'll see through the orange and blue and the yellow how these more robust yet not defined colors are able to bring more abstraction. And this is, I feel like, is the center of this painting, how the very defined shapes contrast with the not so defined colors. And while the shapes hold these colors into place, the colors and their lack of shading and third dimensional perspective from the viewer, you can see that it's not as easy to understand. I think the only shape here with consensus is that top left purplish block, and you're able to see that defined shape. But if you look at it from different perspectives, you can also see it as a slice of a circular wheel, and also as a cone. You can see from the other shapes that there's not as much definition and more consensus to the specific, to that specific block. And you can see from the orange and the yellow and the greenish that these shapes could take in one form as you see it the first time, but when you turn your head, you can see it blending into another shape. And find the final corner that we'll look at, the bottom right. We'll see the contrast between the last two slides, in that it's very robust in its shape and its color, but it also gives you this, as similar to the last slide, it's very abstract in its colors. But as you lurk to the top right of this painting, of this little section, you're able to see that movement from colors in a way that music is used by scales. You can see that the color, and his earlier works of Morgan Russell, that it flows, and the music flows backwards and inwards. And you're able to see from the bottom, especially of this painting, that it kind of points out towards you, but out of nowhere, you know? And you can see from the inner shapes that it's quite divoted in, but at the same time, there's no consensus. They could be divoting out. These shapes have so much meaning to them, and it's so broad, and it's very abstract view. And finally, we'll look at we already went over this, but not in the same way, not in the same perspective. We'll look at the core of the painting. And as you can see, the main focus when you look at any painting is at the center. And especially with abstract art, you'll look straight into the center. And from this, you can see that specifically yellow, green, and red triangle pointing at you. And while that's first always captivates the viewer, the different renditions of this painting, this specific version is from the MoMA, but if you look at other renditions where the colors can be more robust or more mellow, these three colors are the defining features of your own rendition. As the green, I typically see it as blue. Those two colors usually meshing together in my renditions and my perspectives, but in this specific view of the MoMA version of Morgan Russell's Synchrony in orange, and notice how there's specifically no orange and no robust shapes of orange throughout this painting. But we can see that from the bold yellow and red, that those together create this idea of orange in your own head. And of course, you see from the peripherals of your vision that there are little orange shapes. While not defined and not as centered as the yellow and red, it is able to blend in the ideas of that orange. And of course, the greens and yellows quite have more of a shape. And as you can see, that's part of like a pyramid, and then some blocks over there with arcs. You can see that it has shape, but at the same time, its depth and perspective are unlike any other corners that we've seen, as it's much more abstract in its use of dimensions. And as you look more deeply into it, you can see it's blending into the other shapes in the background. In conclusion to this most beautiful piece of art, as a greater picture of a whole, you can see its use of red from the top and its yellow from the right, and how it blends into the deeper, darker brown and green bottoms of the south. But at the same time, its dimensions coming from the top and bottom are both reaching in to the viewer and reaching out to the viewer. And this is constant throughout the whole painting itself. And you can see the the painting as a wall from the outside or from the inside, which brings its very unique abstract shapes into play. And of course the colors bring those shapes its definition. And as opposed to using it as the use of colors to display definition of a building or a person, the use of colors in this case flow out more abstractly in the use of Morgan Russell's theory of and manifesto of color and its use similar to notes in a scale. And you were able to see its derivation and its contrast to the other shapes, and how it blends from the background, but also as you look deep in between the shapes, you can see the nothingness, the very bold nothingness out of this very bold and quite robust painting with its colors gives the viewer some lostness, you know. Its abstractness is far from any that you've seen before. And that will bring my conclusions to this painting and synchronism and its derivations in 20th century art. I thank you very much for your time, and this is presented by Joshua Ng out of Monsters University with a Ph.D. in art studies. Thank you.